So 7 or 8 years ago, I gave a talk to a poets gathering in Berkeley that also had poetry and global warming in the title. And during the week before this particular talk, there had been some press releases put out, and I got into various community calendars. And I got a call at my home office from this guy who said he really, really wanted to talk to me because he was developing a TV comedy series about engineers. And I thought, really? I have a lot of trouble associating comedy and engineers. Excuse me for the engineers in the crowd. Not to strike me as a particularly fertile source. But the other issue is I'd never written TV and I had never written comedy. So I started thinking about it when I talked to this guy. He thought that how poetry can end global warming was the punchline to a joke he hadn't heard yet. And I had to make it clear that I was cold stone serious. And I am. So let me explain. Well, first let's review a little science. So why is there global warming? Well, there is at least 3 fundamental sources. We want to be very simplistic. The first is the growth in the human population. Since 1800, human population has increased over 7 times. Back then, there were a little fewer than 1 billion people on the whole Earth. Now there are in excess of 7. At the same time, carbon emissions have grown markedly. This has to do with the industrialization of the world and also with things like cutting a lot of forest. So that's gone up 9 times in that same 200-year period. And that has brought us into confrontation with various aspects of the physical chemistry of carbon, particularly in the forms of CO2 and methane, that cause the atmosphere to heat up. We've known about that for about a century and nobody took it seriously. Now, those are the 2 fundamental sorts of technological, economic, and political issues that most conversations about global warming kind of stop on. So we talk about things like getting better technology, changing our politics, doing electric cars and all that kind of good thing, pressuring Obama not to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. Yes, I'm in agreement. There is a third cause to this, though, and I think it's one, I'm sure it is one that is not particularly dealt with, or is only now beginning to emerge, and that is spiritual. It lies in the human connection to the cosmos, and I think this is actually the most important source of these particular dilemmas. It is implicit in the world environment. As soon as you say environment, which comes from a Greek root that has to do with surroundings, you are distinguishing yourself from the world around you. So there's a very important dividing line there between the human and the non-human. And we sort of do to the non-human and take from it. That's sort of the attitude. In fact, even in poetry, kind of in the literary world, the phrase nature poetry tends to be diminishing. It's a way of somebody writes sentimental verse about puppies, poppies, and pine trees. And that's a little, well, I don't really agree with that, obviously. But I have a suspicion that this notion, this sort of disparagement of nature, this disconnection from the wild, is the thing that has really gotten us into a particularly deep amount of trouble. I want to read to you 2 poems that highlight both sides of this particular divide. One of these poems I'm sure you already know, because it's one of those pieces of poetry that you cannot get out of high school in this country without hearing at least once. And that's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. I see a lot of nodding. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. This other poem is by Mary Oliver, who I know is well known to this congregation and to an awful lot of folks. She's easily the best-selling poet in the United States these days. But this particular poem is one of her early pieces, and not many people know it. It's called Sleeping in the Forest. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone on the riverbed, nothing between me and the white fire of the stars but my thoughts, and they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in darkness. All night I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. Now you'll notice that both those poems have quite a bit in common. They're both talking about being somewhere in a forest or a woodlot at night. They have a lot of commonality in terms of sound and diction and the palette. They're both written in the first person, so they're relaying what at least appears to be a personal experience. And there are certain kind of very subtle formal differences. I mean, like Frost really loves that iambic tetrameter. And even though Mary Oliver uses a more open form, she in fact uses just as much meter and rhyme as Frost does. The important difference in the two poems, though, is sort of where they go. Take the Frost poem, that very first line, whose woods these are, I think I know. What he's set up in that, first of all, is that this is nothing more than a New England woodlot. It's a patch of forest or a patch of woods owned by somebody. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. It's an owned property. And he finds this aspect of stopping to look at the woods fill up with snow so unusual that even the horse thinks it's queer, quote. And there is an absolute seduction that goes on in that key line. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. That is absolutely erotic language. And then he says, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. It is as if he is rejecting a seduction. He's throwing it over. He won't go into that woods. He won't allow himself to sort of enter that world. Now, Mary Oliver takes a completely different tack. First of all, she calls it the forest, which is a much bigger thing than the woods, right? And she absolutely gives into the particular seduction that is offered to her, and it happens right in the first line. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly. She becomes a creature of the forest darkness, someone who listens to the small kingdoms that are breathing in the night, who enters the night so deeply that she sees dawn, quote, as a luminous doom. Think of how often we think of sunrise as the sign of hope. She is so a part of the world that she sees it as something almost tragic or painful, the luminous doom. And over, she says, she vanished into something better. She crosses over. Where Frost holds on to his ego, even in the language of the poem, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, the I. Mary Oliver says she loses herself. She vanishes into something better. The contrast between these two poems, and there are a lot more that we could look at that kind of fall within these major categories, is that it definitely highlights the spiritual dilemma that underlies much of the climate change issue and other particular, what we call environmental questions, like rapid extinction of species, clean water, and so forth. Basically, if you're apart from something, it's really easy to use and abuse it. If it's not part of you, if you are not somehow identified with its being, you can use it. So the wild world becomes a sort of a giant Home Depot. It's the kind of place you can go to for lumber, for tar sands bitumen, for all kinds of the products that we withdraw from it and use. And there's no particular necessary moral or familial connection with that particular extraction. But if you see yourself as part of the wild world, if you're sort of like Mary Oliver in Sleeping in the Forest, you have a wholly different attitude about taking and using. In fact, you're much less likely to use and abuse than you are to approach the wild, not from an aspect of utility, but from a feeling of awe and reverence. And it is awe and reverence that really informs the poem of Mary Oliver. And the other poems you've heard this morning, like Wild Geese, also by Mary Oliver, and A Blessing by James Wright. I don't want to give Robert Frost all the blame for this. It's not just his doing by any means. And Mary Oliver isn't the only poet who writes in this particular manner, because this particular spiritual divide is considerably older than just contemporary English language poets. If you go back into the Judeo-Christian tradition, and you pick up the Bible and you go only 26 verses into the book of Genesis, you hit, quote, God said, let us make men in our own image, in the likeness of ourselves, and let them be masters of the fish of the sea, the birds of heaven, the cattle, all the wild beasts, and all the reptiles that crawl the earth. God created man in the image of himself. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and conquer it. Be masters of the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all living animals on the earth. That is pretty unmistakable. You know, it's like God made it, and now humankind is the CEO, and we use it the way we wish to. Throughout the Old Testament, you'll notice that usually speaking, natural events are typically signs of God's wrath. I mean, more than anything else. You got Noah's flood, seriously dramatic. You have the sky fire destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, probably for sexual sins, and it was very likely a very old memory of a comet fall. And then you have the plagues of Egypt, where there are locusts, the Nile turns red, the sun is blocked out for days on end. I mean, it's a seriously horrible thing. The New Testament, in a way, is even worse because it actually has almost nothing about the natural world. Curiously, remember the parable of the mustard seed? Jesus said you take this little teeny seed and you put it in the ground, it grows into a great tree. No, it doesn't. Mustard is an annual herb. It grows right out here in the hills. It's about that tall. It's yellow. I mean, it's not a tree. And so, Jesus was a great spiritual teacher. I have huge admiration for him, but he was no botanist. And, there are other things that go on in the Bible. I mean, you've got the fall of the sparrow. You've got the lilies of the field, which is actually quite a gorgeous passage. You have the donkey that carries Jesus into Jerusalem. You have the fig tree that Jesus in a fit of pique blasts. And then in the Acts of the Apostles, you've got all these animals coming down from on high. But the reason they're there is to tell St. Peter that no longer are the unclean unclean. You can eat pigs. So it's really about a lobster, which was really a good addition to the diet. So there's this thing where these are not animals in terms of other species that we're somehow connected to. Rather, they're food items. And so a lot of the Judeo-Christian tradition builds this barrier between the human and the non-human, typically with intellect somehow in the way. The wild world in this place becomes dangerous, pagan, and animal. I mean, it is not by any mistake that there's a serpent in the Garden of Eden. That serpent is what really personifies or represents the wild, the savage, the primitive, the unsaved. It's also not accidental that St. Augustine, certainly the most prominent Catholic theologian before Thomas Aquinas, called his book about the nature of goodness the city of God. Because there was this contradistinction going on there between the civilized world and the wild world. And the civilized world is godly and the wild world is, wild. So there's kind of a straight line between the Judeo-Christian tradition and a poem like Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, in that rejection of the seduction, because it really is something of a seduction. Now, curiously, though, in the Bible even, there are echoes of a somewhat different point of view. And you find them particularly in my three favorite books in the Old Testament. The first one is the book of Job, which is about why bad things happen to good people. And that's an unsolvable problem, of course. And at the end of that book, there is a poem that is spoken by a whirlwind. It comes up out of nowhere and whirls around, and it basically says, Job, who do you think you are? You think you're the center of the universe, and you're not. That's sort of the moral wrap-up. You know, it's like all this stuff happens we don't understand. There is, as in the musical piece that Sierra Lynn and Larry performed, a mystery that we don't grasp. Then there's the book of Jonah, the shortest book in the Bible, in which the whale or the great fish that swallows Jonah and takes him up and coughs him up on the shores of the city of Nineveh is there to teach him a very important lesson in compassion, about understanding that he has connections with and feelings both with other people and other animal life. And finally, there's the Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon or the Canticle of Canticles. And it's really a collection, of erotic poems that are very much about sexuality, often outside. And that's about as wild as you can get. And it is the only book in the Bible that never once names God in any of the forms of God in Hebrew. Not a one. In other words, it's almost like the experience of sexuality is the presence of God. That is not a majority viewpoint in the Old Testament. But it has about it, all three of these books have about them the same sort of reverence and awe that you hear in Sleeping in the Forest. And they're right there still within our tradition. It also occurs outside the biblical tradition. For example, within Catholicism, or that mainline Christianity, there are of course the nature mystics like Francis of Assisi. We've sung 2 of his hymns this morning. He had this notion that being out in the woods was how you came into contact with the divine. He has a brother in Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of Hasidism in Poland in the 18th century. And he would go out in the woods and preach to the animals, and he would dance his joy of God. He and Francis should have met. That would have been an amazing conversation. And there are various Muslim Sufi mystics, people like Kabir and Rumi, who have a very similar attitude. In fact, if you look at any of the writings or the sayings of these particular traditions, you will find that they often sound almost the same. And like Thomas Merton, who really picked up where Francis of Assisi left off in some ways in the 20th century, found himself being drawn to the Buddhists and to the Sufis more than back into his own religion of Catholicism, because that's where he found these strong mystic voices. There are also the indigenous traditions, the sort of animated, spirit-filled landscapes that if you've had the lucky experience of traveling in parts of the Southwest, I've seen it there when I was being told by an Apache river guide about how there were certain spirits that lived in particular canyons, and the Navajos knew which ones they were, and the Apaches knew others, and they just had this entire landscape that was full of spirit. And I've seen it in rural Ireland as well, where every time there's a spring coming up somewhere, people go out and tie little pieces of ribbon on it to mark it, and they put little roadside shrines by every single grotto. And that's less about Catholicism than it is about understanding how the particular place they live in is full of all these spiritual presences. It's very much like what is going on in Sleeping in the Forest, with the small kingdoms breathing in the middle of the night. That these folks, these indigenous traditions, understand that reality, and they have a connection with the wild that is very different from the one that we have. Now, there are a number of prose writers who have, I think, discovered this particular distinction and talked about it quite a bit. You've got people like, obviously John Muir. Many of his writings sound absolutely like they're out of the Old Testament. You've got people like Aldo Leopold, the marvelous writer in Sand County Almanac, who was also a professional forester. Barry Lopez in Arctic Dreams. Edward Abbey in his absolutely madcap Desert Solitaire. Terry Tempest Williams, Gretel Ehrlich. And there are novelists, too, people like Louise Erdrich, the Native American writer, and Barbara Kingsolver, who often write about the wild in this larger sense, very much as if they were channeling the same sort of energy that Mary Oliver does in Sleeping in the Forest. But there is a problem with prose. Prose is actually a very linear form of writing. It goes from point A to point B to point M to point Z. There's even a statement in I picked up recently from a poetry teacher I work with who said, prose proceeds and verse reverses. Okay, what's that? Well, it means that there's this logicality to prose. It has to move through like this, right? Poetry is actually vastly older than prose. It goes way, way back into ritual and song, the very beginnings of human culture. It's not that poetry is like really short prose. It's that what we now think of as prose really didn't even arise probably until just a few centuries before the Common Era. People began writing that way. And the idea of the reversal is that in early Greek poetry, the poet wrote to the end of the line and skipped down and wrote backwards. So he's going right and left. It's called booster faden. It means the plowing with the ox. So it's just like how you go with the plow back and forth behind an animal. And so poetry has this ability to keep moving round and round and round on the same topic and keeping a very intense focus. And it also uses language that is highly imagistic and musical and it's also highly compressed. It's really right down. If you take a poem like Wild Geese and try and take one word out of it, you'll find out you can't do it without absolutely changing the meaning. And the other thing poetry really gives us is that when poetry is recited or shared within a community, it has a certain communal power to it. People really listen to poetry. And I have a suspicion that that comes from the work that's been done by some neuroscientists. It's a guy whose name escapes me, but he has written, he says, "This is your brain on music." And it's a serious work. I mean, it's about the fact that singing and choral music absolutely excites the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that has to do with cooperation and collaboration. So when we sing hymns together, it creates a communal feeling. And I found often that when you do poetry in a circle, that you get the same kind of a reaction. People somehow move in on it, almost as if it were a prayer. In fact, I think poetry doesn't simply talk about experience, it actually creates the experience. And that's why it's so critical to this understanding of this distinction between the human and the non-human and the particular dilemma we find ourselves in. If you remember back to David Takahashi Morris's sermon on Scripture, you use Scripture, I think he gave, I believe it was on St. Patrick's Day. He said that one of the aspects of Scripture is that in encountering the text, you actually have an experience of the divine. There's something about reading it or sharing it or singing it that creates this sense of the divine and the cosmic. And poetry can do that, as I think you've already heard this morning in poems like A Blessing and Wild Geese and Sleeping in the Forest. It has the ability to create an experience of what in this world is cosmic and divine. Now, if you read the New Yorker every couple of weeks, you're probably wondering, but the poetry I read there doesn't do that. And you're right, it doesn't. Because a lot of the poetry that is written today just simply avoids it. But there is a considerable amount of poetry now being written in not only English, but also probably in Spanish and German, which are two of the languages I follow, that have a similar kind of resonance as Mary Oliver. And I want to give you some notion of how you can tell. What is it that sets aside something like Mary Oliver's Sleeping in the Forest? The first thing is, unlike poems you might bump into in the New Yorker or in a lot of modern poetry classes, is that the language is accessible. It's not cynical. It's not ironic. It's not nasty. It's straightforward. And it's often very simple. And I want to say seemingly simple. That is, the language, like, just think about, I thought she remembered me. She took me back so tenderly. That line sounds effortless. It's not. Mary Oliver had to work really hard to get it, but her point was to get a line that was so clear and so clean and so unmistakable that you could only take it the way she intends it, and it has a certain rhythm and music to it. The second thing that's going on in a poem like that one is that the poem builds from a revelation that is rooted in the natural world, often as counterposed to the conventional world. It doesn't have to be off in some distant wilderness. I want to make that really clear. We're not talking about walking the John Muir Trail here. If you take Wendell Berry's The Peace of Wild Things, the poem that Sierra Lynn read for the offertory, that takes place on his tobacco farm in Kentucky. Now, that's rural, but it's not by any means wild. You take James Wright's A Blessing, the first line was, just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota. That is about as prosaic a Midwestern setting as you can get. And take again what's going on in a poem like Wild Geese. The very first line of it is, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. In just 3 lines, Mary Oliver has dismissed 2 millennia of thinking about sin and repentance. Boom, it's off the table, just like that. And she's just saying, drop it. Gone. Then she says, this is what's just wonderful. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. She's saying, be within yourself. Be the animal that you are. And then the next step is, tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. She's creating the beloved community. That's this place right here, now. That is that we have enough trust and sharing that we can move in here and we can talk about despair. But then watch what that poem does next. The next line is, absolutely next line, meanwhile, the world goes on. So that's not where it stops. That's the third thing that's going on, is that we've gotten away from the focus on sin. We begin to understand something about the animal of our own bodies. We're creating the loving community of mutual trust and respect. And now we can actually take it and move it outward. It gets bigger. That's what happens in that line. Meanwhile, the world goes on. It doesn't stop there. This isn't self-help. This is about a larger cosmic understanding of the world. And the amazing thing, too, that happens in these poems, usually right at the end, is that invitation to move into the wild world actually changes your relationship with it. You'll notice that in the piece of Wild Things, where at the very beginning of it, Wendell Berry talks about feeling anxious about the nature of the world. And at the end he says, for a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. You know, all of it, his whole relationship with what's going on around him has shifted. Mary Oliver says, think again, by morning I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. And in the Wild Geese, I think even almost more tellingly, she says that the wild geese, the high, harsh, exciting voices of the wild geese, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. You have been put right where you are within this larger wild community. Now, none of these poems is political in any topical sense about that. And the truth of the matter is that usually speaking, it's hard to get politics into poems, very typically. William Carlos Williams, the great Imagist poet of the middle of the last century, one time said, quote, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." In other words, if you turn that around now, where the poems that we have been talking about absolutely accept this community and the larger family of the wild, if we understand where we belong in the family of things, and if you believe that the beloved community reaches out beyond this place into this larger world, then you have to understand that we need to treat the world of the wild with reverence and awe. We don't clear-cut the rest of Washington State. We don't trawl the last cod off the Newfoundland banks. We don't think it's good business to take mountaintops off in West Virginia to strip mine the coal underneath. And we certainly don't build a pipeline to carry tar sands bitumen across the largest aquifer on the North American prairie. Now, none of these poems says that, but they don't have to, because they create that sense of the beloved community, the scriptural experience of the wild that allows us to rethink our politics. I want to close with a poem that really catches almost all these elements and also has a wonderful, just delightful power to it. It's The Snakes of September by Stanley Kunitz. If you saw Bill Moyer's program on poetry, you saw Stanley Kunitz, who lived to be 100 years old. He was the absolute dean of American poetry. He was a fascinating old man. The Snakes of September. All summer I heard them rustling in the shrubbery, outracing me from tier to tier in my garden, a whisper among the viburnums, a signal flash from the hedgerow, a shadow pulsing in the barberry thicket. Now that the nights are chill and the annuals spent, I should have thought them long gone, in a torpor of blood, slipped to the netherworld before the sickle frost. Not so. In the deceptive balm of noon, as if defiant of the curse that spoiled another garden, these two appear on show through a narrow slit in the dense green brocade of a North Country spruce, dangling head down, entwined in a brazen love knot. I put out my hand and stroke the fine, dry grit of their skins. After all, we are partners in this land, co-signers of a covenant. At my touch, the wild braid of creation trembles. At my touch, the wild braid of creation trembles.